Welcome back to Put the Metal On. My name is Dave Cullen. We're back for another metal music review. Today we're going to be talking about the brand new album A Sonication from German death metal band Obscura. Obscura, of course, have been a defining force in technical and progressive death metal for many years now, blending virtuosistic musicianship with philosophical and cosmic themes. Their career trajectory, though, before A Sonication was marked by both artistic triumphs and significant lineup changes, which ultimately has shaped the album's direction. Let's talk about it further first by first of all talking about their early years. So obviously Obscura were formed in 2002 by guitarist and vocalist Stefan Kummermer in Germany. Initially it was influenced by the technical death metal pioneers such as Def and Silic. Their self-released album Retribution, released in 2006, was a solid but relatively conventional technical death metal album, lacking that unique identity that would later develop. The real turning point came from them with Cosmogenesis in 2009. This album saw Obscura evolve to a formally formed identity, of course partly thanks to the arrival of bassist Johann Paul Tieseling and drummer Hans Grossmann. The album fused jaw-dropping technicality with melodic elements and a sci-fi inspired atmosphere, setting a new standard for modern technical death metal. Songs like Anti-Cosmic Overload and Incarnated became instant classics, and the album's balance of precision and emotion made it a genre-defining work. Building to this success then, Omnivalium in 2011 pushed them further into progressive territory. The compositions were more intricate, their songwriting more ambitious, and they embraced more neoclassical guitar lines and fretless bass wizardry. The album also explored more philosophical themes, adding more intellectual weight to the band's already cerebral sounds. It was in this album that Obscura established themselves as more than just a technical showcase. They were storytellers, visionaries in the extreme metal scene. After Omnivalium, though, the band underwent a massive upheaval. Tieseling, Grossmann, and guitarist Christian Musner all departed due to creative differences and personal reasons, leaving Kummermer as the sole remaining member for a while. Given how integral these musicians were to Obscura's sound, many feared that the band's golden era was over at this point. However, rather than folding, they ended up being rebuilt with bassist Lumis Koznietzer, drummer Sebastian Ledzer, and guitarist Rafael Trujo. Forgive my pronunciation. Their 2016 album Archorosis, an album that retained Obscura's signature complexity, but also leaned into even more melody and atmosphere. While some fans did feel the loss of the raw aggression from earlier works, others praised the albums for its more cinematic and refined approach. Diluvium then in 2018 marked the conclusion of a 4-album conceptual arc exploring the philosophical themes that they did before. It was probably Obscura at their most polished and structured, featuring more clean vocals and orchestral arrangements. And while it was very well received, there's some long-term fans that felt like the album sacrificed a lot of its spontaneity in favour of accessibility. But that being said, this album really cemented Obscura's place as one of the more forward-thinking bands of the genre. Following Diluvium, though, yet another dramatic lineup change happens. Koznietzer, Lanzer, and Trujo all left to form their own band Obsidious, leaving once again Kummermer in a now familiar position of having to rebuild the band all over again. For their 2021 record of Validation, Obscura once again introduced a new lineup, with Tieseling and Mutzer returning to the band, Tieseling after a decade-long absence, and also new drummer David Diebold. This was a very striking move, particularly with Mutzner and Tieseling, who have been critical for their early work, making A Validation feel like both a continuation but also a re-innovation. The album itself, though, took a very surprising turn, incorporating more traditional songwriting structures, groove elements, and even thrash inspirations. Some songs such as Solace and When Stars Collide had a level of catchiness rarely heard in Obscura's past work, and while this direction made the album more accessible, it also divided fans a lot too. Some praise its streamlined approach, while others feel it lacks that adventurous spirit from their earlier albums. By this point then, it was clear Obscura were entering a new phase, one less concerned with sheer complexity and more focusing crafting engaging dynamic compositions. Once the dust settled from that album, the band did continue to tour very heavily, solidifying their chemistry from their lineup. However, behind the scenes there was once again another lineup change, with this time Robin Zielhaus replacing Tieseling once again leaving, and Kevin Hollas replacing Mutzer on guitar. So going into the record of A Sonication, the Obscura found themselves in a very interesting position. They have already experimented with more of a streamlined sound from a validation. They had to integrate new members once again, which could bring in either fresh creativity or result in growing pains. And also you have to understand that the technical death genre is beginning to evolve again, with new bands such as Arc Beyond Creation and First Fragment really pushing the boundaries of the genre. It created the question, where would Obscura be able to adapt to this, or would they risk sounding stagnant as a result? Therefore, there was an expectation with this new album. It would either redefine the balance between their technical roots and newer songwriting sensibilities, or it could be an experimental leap. So as I explained from Obscura's journey up to A Sonication, it's one of constant reinvention. While their commitments to technical excellence has never wavered, the frequent lineup changes created an underlying sense of instability. Now there's positives and negatives to that. There's consistently strong musicianship regardless who's playing, a willingness to involve whether through conceptual ambitious albums, atmospheric expansion or streamlined songwriting, and a clear identity rooted on technical precision, melody and philosophical themes. However, no matter what way you look at it, the frequent lineup changes make it very difficult for anybody to truly create a truly unified creative direction. Also, there's the risk of technical mastery overshadowing the emotional depth, and a tendency to repeat certain songwriting structures, making some albums feel less adventurous over time. Therefore, going into this album, Obscura found themselves really at a crossroads. Were they still the same cutting-edge force they once were, or had they settled into a pattern of diminishing returns? The challenge for this album is to move forward whether they recapture the sense of surprise and audacity from albums they made, particularly Cosmogenesis and Omnivalium, which made them really special. Obscura are definitely still a powerhouse, but the question remains, will they still innovate again, or will they remain a cycle of refinements? Well, let's find out by first talking about the album's overall composition and cohesion. So A Sonication attempts to deliver a cohesive journey, but the flow does feel slightly uneven, I have to say. The album kicks off with really high energy in silver linings, immediately throwing the listener into a whirlwind of technicality. But as it progresses, the pacing does feel somewhat predictable. Certain tracks I feel are almost interchangeable in their structure and intensity, making the overall experience feeling slightly homogeneous. But that being said, there's also well-placed moments of contrast, such as the more atmospheric Beyond the Seventh Sun, which adds a brief but welcome shift in the moods. Obscura have always maintained a core identity, intricate fretwork, rapid shifts in time signatures and melodic undercurrents. But in this record, I feel it does lean more on familiar formulas. And while there are moments of variety, particularly in the acoustic passages and clean interludes, the album doesn't really explore new ground as boldly as I felt from the other releases they had. And while there's definitely technical brilliance, the variety isn't enough to consistently surprise or grip the listener from start to finish. There's some interludes that definitely serve a purpose, like the Prolong, for example, breaks up the intensity very well. But there's also some that feel like deliberate breathers, which doesn't add anything meaningful at all for me for the album's structure. And while they don't completely disrupt the flow, they also don't elevate it in a significant way either. At 39 minutes long, the overall album definitely avoids by overstaying its welcome, but paradoxically, it feels very repetitive as well. The consistent tempo and familiar songwriting approach across multiple tracks make the runtime feel a lot longer than it actually is. And unlike other albums they've made, which leave you eager to restart from track one, A Sonication feels more like an album you respect rather than one you immediately feel compelled to revisit. At least that's how I felt. We'll talk about the replay value later on in this video, but first let's talk about the songwriting and arrangements. In terms of memorability, I feel this is where the album falls short. While Obscura's technical wizardry is ever present, A Sonication lacks that true standout riff or choruses that linger in the mind after the album ends. Like, I don't really recall anything that sticks to my mind. Their lead single, Even Flow, is very solid, but it feels like it's designed more to showcase technical prowess rather than to create a lasting impact. Arguably the most memorable track is probably The Sun Eater, where thrasher influences inject a much more needed shot of adrenaline. Obscura are obviously one of the best there is at the moment in terms of crafting technical advanced compositions. But there's also a fine line between structure complexity and over-reliance on the technical trope. Obviously very impressive, but some of the arrangements also feel like they're more concerned with showcasing the musicianship, as I said, rather than crafting that emotionally resonant song. So the risk here is that complexity alone doesn't always make up for compelling storytelling here, and it's very evident in this case, at least in this form of music. Their best works tend to blend mind-bending technique with a palpable sense of grandeur, mystery, and melancholy. But in this record, I just feel it's slightly colder than usual. There's definitely a mechanical precision, but I definitely feel it's at cost of some emotional weight. Tracks like Stardust, for example, attempts to incorporate more melancholic passages, but they don't hit as hard as similar moments from previous albums though. Lyrically, Obscura have consistently explored philosophical and cosmic themes, and while the lyrics here are likely to continue in that vein, they don't stand out as particularly compelling for me. The lyrics definitely are secondary to the instrumentation here, which, don't get me wrong, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that the record lacks that thematic depth that could have added more layer of intrigue to the record as well. So it comes to the cost. Now let's talk about the performance and musicianship. As you'd expect, flawless. Absolutely flawless. The guitar work from Stefan Kummermer and new addition Kevin Olaz is razor sharp, blending intricate leads with precision-driven rhythm sections. Robin Zielhost's fretless bass lines are a highlight of the record, while James Stewart's drumming is both technical and controlled. So in terms of purely a performance-based perspective, the album is fantastic. Dare I say, a masterpiece. But again, while the musicianship is undeniable, it does feel like an exercise in technical efficiency rather than an album brimming with passion. So it does come at an expense. You have to understand that's a very tricky balance, because while there's definitely fans of progressive and technical death metal that definitely will find a lot to admire here, there's also those who are looking for more organic songwriting that may find this album probably a little too calculated. So it's a very tricky balance to find. Kummer's vocals are signature, definitely bring power, but I don't feel they bring anything particularly new to the album either. They're good, don't get me wrong, but that lacks that raw urgency that elevates the album, I think, from goods to great. The drum and basses overall provide a very strong backbone, with Zielhost's fretless playing adding a layer of fluidity that prevents the album from feeling too rigid. But at the same time, I also feel that it could have been more pronounced in the mix. I don't know how many times I have to say that. Stewart's drumming is, well, very technically impressive. It occasionally blends into the background rather than commanding attention as well. I think that's a shame either. You have to hear both drums and bass. Speaking of which, let's talk about the production and sound quality. The production is very clean, very polished, but perhaps sometimes too much. While every instrument is very audible, the mix sometimes lacks that dynamic range needed to give the songs a bit more of an organic feel. So it's quite ironic, while everything sits in place, it's because of that it feels less alive, if that makes sense. The guitar tones are very precise, very cutting, which suits Obscura's style, but I also feel like it sounds somewhat sterile at times as well. The bass tone, as I mentioned, is definitely a highlight. Its clarity and depth adds much needed contrast to the album. The drums sound very powerful, but they don't always have the natural punch that would make them stand out either. Some sections feel less compressed, which diminishes the impacts of his otherwise excellent playing. The vocals sit very well in the mix, neither too loud nor too buried, but the production doesn't add much texture or character to them either. Perhaps if there was more of a raw approach to the vocals, it would make the delivery sound way more visceral. Very wisely, Obscura avoid overloading the album with any unnecessary effects, and while there's some synths and reverb in there, it's there to complement the instrumentation rather than overshadowing it. But that said, I feel there's a tiny bit more atmospheric layering. It could have helped differentiate some of the songs from the others as well. Which brings me on to the creativity and originality of the album. I feel this is where the album struggles. While it's undeniably an Obscura record, true, it doesn't push the band's identity forward in a meaningful way either. In other words, it feels like a refinement of their existing sounds rather than a bold step into new territory. So as I mentioned, it's like they're not trying to adapt to perhaps the new technical death metal bands I brought up earlier. Their influences remain evident, particularly their influences of Death and Cynic. But while past albums synthesize these elements into something fresh, this record feels like more of a safe play. It's very well crafted, but it doesn't challenge expectations in the way Omnivalium or Cosmogenesis did. The album definitely stays true then to its progressive and technical death metal framework, and while there are exceptions to that, particularly with the acoustic passages, there's nothing there to truly expand neither the genre or Obscuria's own sonic palette either. That brings us on to our replay value and impact. Now, for technical death metal fans, this is definitely worth multiple listens purely on the musicianship alone. As I said, it's probably, if not a masterpiece. But also, because of its somewhat formulaic approach, it doesn't have the same staying power of their past records. Songs like The Sun Eater and Beyond the Seventh Sun definitely offer the more engaging moments of the record, but no track really feels like an undeniable classic from their collection either. And while the album will very likely be very well received within the progressive and technical metal circles, it doesn't really land as a landmark release in the genre for me. So it's very solid, but not really era-defining, especially in consideration to the new music that's coming out in the genre. It's there, but it won't stand out as much as I would have hoped anyway. So for my final verdict, it's a record that definitely showcases Obscuria's technical excellence, but it also plays a little too safe. It's a refined, polished work, and it will definitely please long-term fans, but it also lacks that sense of daring that made their earlier albums really stand out. And while there's definitely something there for lovers of technical death metal, there's definitely a lot to appreciate. If you're looking for something groundbreaking, I'm afraid this will leave you wanting more. I wanted more for sure. And that's another metal music review. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you liked today's video, please give it a like. If you haven't followed us yet, please do give us a subscribe. And what do you guys think? What was your favorite song? Do you agree or disagree with me? Do you like this album? Do you think it was too safe? What do you think of the technicality? Please let us know. We'll be back once again for more metal music reviews once again. I hope you enjoyed this one. So we'll see you again soon. My name is Dave Cullen. This has been Put Metal On. Stay safe and enjoy the metal.